So, good morning. Welcome to a session entirely devoted to navigation in Android. My name's Rich Fulcher. I'm one of the interaction designers on the Android user experience team.
And I'm Adam Powell. I'm a framework engineer in Mountain View.
And we both kind of care passionately about navigation. In fact, when I first applied to work at Google 3 years ago, resolving questions with back was part of my first interview to become an interaction designer here. So we're going to take you through a lot of content today. So to get started, to really kind of understand tasks in Android, first you have to have a good understanding of how tasks behave. And then Adam will help set the stage for that.
So a lot of early Android apps talked about being task managers, but generally they were actually talking about managing processes. In Android, a process can be a container for multiple components, and a task can contain activities hosted by many different processes. They really aren't the same thing.
So let's just do a couple of examples of this. This is a really simple task that we'll build out. We're going to open Gmail, and we're going to dive in and view a conversation. And the way I'm going to show a bunch of examples during this talk is with this format. The left-hand side of the screen will show kind of the state of the task stack as activities are added to it. And the right-hand side will show kind of the screen progression that the user experiences as they navigate. So starting here, we start at the home screen. We have kind of the launcher activity at the base of the task stack for us. Clicking on the Gmail icon from home opens up the activity for the Gmail conversation list. I'm just going to use wireframes throughout this talk just to kind of keep the focus on the navigation itself. And so that has added the conversation list activity onto the task stack. If I navigate deeper, I go down into a particular conversation to view the messages inside of that. Then the conversation view is added as well. And that's kind of just building up a very simple task. Another slightly more complicated example involves activities that are coming from multiple applications. Adam mentioned that we can do this within a single task. That's one of the strengths of Android. So I'm going to start at home again. I'm going to enter into talk, where I see the friend list, the list of everybody I can have a conversation with. I'll pick a particular friend from that list, go into the chat view, that activity gets added on. Now let's say that friend had sent me a link to a YouTube video. I can continue into a different application. In this case, I can go to YouTube, and that activity is added to the task stack as well. The same system, we're just adding and adding and adding on top to the task stack. And I can go further. If I wanted to watch this video and then share it with a friend, I can hit the share button, and that'll take me to Gmail's compose screen, yet another activity that would just drop onto the task stack. So now we've finished this example. We've got launcher at the root of the stack. We've got activities from 3 different applications, all part of this one continuous task. And this is the way that tasks have always worked inside of Android, all the way back to Android 1.0. And one particular control, the back button, has been along for the whole ride. Although over time, it's kind of changed its appearance a little bit. It's now trimmer than it used to be. So back works by unwinding that task stack that we build up. It actually unwinds the global history stack. We'll get into that in a little bit more detail. It finishes off the current activity. So when I hit back, the activity has the opportunity to do things, save out any local state that it wants to preserve, and then kind of clears itself away off the task stack. And the activity manager brings forward the next lower down activity and presents that to the user. Now, of course, there are a couple of exceptions. Most of these just relate to when back handles a local bit of state within the activity. So things like if the keyboard, the virtual keyboard is displayed, back will recede that. If there are dialogues or spinners that have popped open, back will dismiss those. If you have a selection mode, back will get rid of that. And then a subsequent press of back in all of those cases will actually act as the navigation. There are also a few instances where back is kind of completely taken over by the application. The browser is the most obvious and notable example of that, where back becomes back through your browsing history, kind of historical browsing context within browser. So going back to the 2 examples we covered at the start, what does back do? Well, it's actually really simple in both cases. Back from Gmail just pops that activity off the stack, and the conversation list comes to the front. Hitting back again finishes that activity, returns me to home. Same is true for the slightly more complex case. Again, we built up these different activities from different apps, but back just walks through them just as comfortably. Back, 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 back to home. And once we're at home, there's no place further back to go. So kind of back loses meaning once it lands in that context. You've got a safe root point to do all of your exploration from. So now Adam's going to talk a little bit about how multiple tasks work.
Right, we've been focused on single tasks so far, but how do multiple tasks behave? So you might have noticed that the recents list here is a whole lot like something else that you might be used to using day to day. So it's very similar to just your browser tab list. But so how do tasks really work in the context of Android with this? I mean, and what are all those intent flags that you see in the developer documentation? There's a lot about how tasks work internally that isn't immediately obvious, but it really helps make things feel right to the user when they're all put together. And it's useful for you as a developer to know how a bunch of this stuff is going on under the hood, even if your users don't have to. Okay. So Activity Manager, which is the component that sort of ties all of this navigation together, sees the world as one big global activity stack sorted by task. So this might explain some of the behavior that you've seen here and there that might have made you scratch your head. So if I hit back a few times, I'll pop from the top of the stack until I hit home. Home then prevents me from popping further. The rest of the stack still exists, though. This is part of my global navigation history across the system. So we said before that your list of tasks in Android is very similar to your tabs in a browser. So how do you open a new tab? How do you create a new task? So in an example here, from home, we open Talk. A new task is created. And further navigation within Talk just adds to that same task. So how many of you use tabbed browsing out there? Show of hands? Up. OK, pretty much everybody. So keep your hand up if you end up with way too many tabs open at the end of the day. Oh, look at that, just as many people. So we really didn't want to have the same problem happen in Android, because manually curating your browser tabs really stinks. You kind of have to do this manual garbage collection pass every now and then just to make sure that things stay cleaned up and that you can still understand what the heck you're doing on your desktop. So we have this idea called task affinity in Android. Task affinity lets us keep a single context associated with a task instead of multiple tasks that are very, very similar. And this avoids having multiple tabs open for doing the same thing. So how does this work? When we launch an activity into a new task here, and a task with the same affinity already exists, then the existing task gets brought to the front. Now, if the intent that we just launched matches the root intent of that existing task, the one that's at the very bottom of the task stack, then we're done. We have nothing else to do. So what it means for an intent to match is a little unintuitive if you're not familiar with this particular little detail here, is that intent extras don't count. They're always app-specific, and the system really doesn't even pretend to know how to unparcel them and compare them for any sort of equivalence. So that means that intents can match even if they have very different extras. But all of this put together means that this is why Launcher is able to act as a task switcher on its own. Shortcuts always launch a new task, and it's always the root activity of that task if it was already existing. So before Honeycomb, this is how a lot of users got around the system. You would just hit home, and then you would reopen the app that you wanted, but it would reopen to exactly the same state that it was in the previous time that you were using it.
So now we've got a handle on how tasks work. We've talked a little bit about affinity, how back behaves. But navigation has evolved during Android's history. And in particular, we'll talk about up and recents and how they've been added. So let's bring the timeline back up. By the start of 2010, we knew we kind of had a problem, or more exactly, that we knew that our users were having several problems when it came to navigation within Android. Part of this comes from, we had system-level controls for navigation. We had back, which we've talked about, and we had home. Home was kind of a task switcher, but it was a little bit awkward for that. I'd have to hit the home key, I'd come back to the home screen. Maybe the task I'm trying to switch to isn't on that home screen, so I might have to locate it. Or maybe it is on any of the home screens, and I have to bring up the All Apps drawer to find it. We had a more elegant way of doing that, which was our recents control, which you'd invoke by kind of long pressing on home. And it would bring up not a lot of details about the tasks. You'd get kind of 5 application icons and 5 labels. But we knew from listening to the users that people just didn't know this function existed. It was really a very hidden power user feature, and users were craving something that was a lot more obvious than that. What about for the application level navigation controls? These are switching between tasks. What about or moving within a task? What about inside an app? We didn't have any story really there. Now, that didn't stop charming, clever developers such as yourselves from coming up with ways to work around this. One popular one was to take the menu button and to add additional actions into that would target specific activities within your application. So it might be that you added an action to go to the home of your app, or to go to a common screen like an account list or an inbox, those types of things. Another approach that a lot of apps took was to take the back button and try to turn it into something like a structural navigation element by overriding its behavior. A lot of apps did this. I've worked on apps that did this, Gmail. But it made the back button very inconsistent for users. They couldn't really predict what was going to happen when in certain contexts it would get overridden and do something different. So we wanted to address those. I think a problem that happened with a lot of early Android applications is that it was easy to build them in a way that it was just kind of like a bag of activities that you would throw your activities into, and you could shake it up, and the user could kind of move to different activities through whatever affordances you wanted to give them. And there might be a top doorway in, but once you started kind of diving in a little bit, you could get these paths that kind of were a little bit formless, a little bit unpredictable. You could even have kind of circuits in the path where I start from one screen and follow a forward navigating path that takes me back to that same screen, in which case back gets quite interesting. We definitely heard from coworkers, from users, a lot of frustration. And when people are frustrated, they come talk to their designers. So we didn't want to be associated with this. We wanted to take this problem head on and really try to do something about it. So we did. We started at I/O 2 years ago. Myself and a few other members of the user experience team were on a stage about this size, talking about 5 interface patterns that we thought were helpful for app developers. And one of the ones we introduced in that session talked about was the action bar. So the action bar was trying to solve 2 problems. The first was to make the most common actions more visible, and you've kind of heard about that in the sessions earlier today, so I won't go there. But the other thing it tried to do is kind of give the sense of structure and place to the app. The action bar was intended to replace the old title bar element. Internally, we called it the interactive title bar for quite a while. So the area at the left would give you the app icon and the name of the activity that you were currently viewing, but it would also be a touch target for kind of jumping back up to the top of the application, in the same way that a user might expect to kind of touch at the logo at the upper left corner of a website to kind of come back to the home of that site. So we're trying to play off those conventions. Now that said, what we gave you at I/O 2 years ago was far from perfect. It was an interface pattern. It wasn't supported by the framework. It wasn't a code pattern yet. We were just kind of offering, this would be a good thing for you to go and do. And it also only supported one target, which was navigating directly to the top of the application. And for some apps, that's fine and that's suitable. For apps with deeper hierarchy, you want to have a little bit more subtlety than that. At the time, we were demonstrating the Facebook app and the Twitter app during that session. And those have kind of much richer set of activities. They kind of have entire subsections to those apps. And a little bit more navigation control would have been appropriate. So in 2010, we did Gingerbread. Didn't really change the story there. But in 2011 and 2012, we really started tackling this problem. We wanted to take the direction we'd laid out with that kind of alpha version of the action bar and really reinforce the story that was there. And even as we were chatting at I/O 2 years ago, we were already hard at work on our tablet UI. So we started rolling that thought right into Honeycomb, what would become the full action bar. And then in ICS, we brought it to phone with even more capabilities. And navigation was a critical part of that. So a lot of what we tried to do in those 2 releases was motivated by what we saw from user research. We did very frequent testing for Honeycomb. Literally, we would have 2 or 3 sessions a week with 4 or 5 different participants in a given session for 4 months when we were testing Honeycomb. And during all of those tests, we were testing navigation to some extent. We were testing a lot of different applications, but that kind of glue that let the user get to the applications and switch between them was always something that we were looking at. When I think about evaluating what research can do for you, I think the wrong question that people ask too often is, they do an experiment and then they say, well, did the product test well? I think a more valuable question to ask is, did we glean some new insights to the problems that we're trying to solve? And when it comes to navigation and the work we did in Honeycomb, we learned a lot. Our 4 big takeaways were that kind of this notion of the navigation being in the upper left corner of the screen, calling back to their experience with the web and with other devices, was really powerful for users and felt very natural. Users wanted to make a clear distinction between navigation that kept you inside an application and navigation controls that were outside of it. So, users definitely had a distinction between things that we would render in the application's content area and things that would be rendered in the system bar, or more typically at the time, that would be kind of physical hardware controls that were on the device. There was sometimes kind of a mapping problem moving between those 2 sets for users. And users also wanted to have a safe form of navigation. And they wanted to know that the affordances or the controls that they would use would be able to keep them within the app that they were currently viewing. Users were incredibly frustrated when they would press a back button and unexpectedly it'd be jettisoned from an app. That's back to our bag of activities from before. And then finally, quick, obvious task switching was super important to them, so we wanted to address that. So we added 2 controls in Honeycomb and ICS to cover those issues. Up was looking at kind of those first 3 issues, the upper left corner, the inside-outside problem, and the predictability of remaining within the application, that safety guarantee. And recents was our way of taking that question of task switching and making it dead obvious for the user. So I'll go into detail on both of these. First, up. Up is structural navigation. We've hit that point a couple of times today, but I'll hit it again. It's going to keep you in the app. When you're at the top of the app, you don't even see it because it's all about navigating in the app. You're at the top. There's no further to go. It's completely independent of the task state. So all those examples that I showed before of how the task stack builds, your behavior of up isn't affected by what's on that task stack. It's based entirely upon the relationships between the different activities that you've constructed in your app, kind of the right parent-child relationships that exist there. It can alter the task stack as a side effect, but it's not dependent upon it. And then as a result, up is not back. They sometimes will have the same effect for the user, but they behave differently. And there are a couple of critical cases where they're actually quite different. So let's kind of dive into those. So the first is when you're reading through, kind of doing a browsing session and you're going to related views. So an example here that we'll use is I've gone into the Play Store. I'm looking at a list of books. Maybe it's the featured books. And I pick a book that I want to view more details about, and I go and I see that book details screen. Now, part of a lot of store experiences is that part of the items display will give you a list of related content items that users also liked that might show other books. And when you browse to that, and you click on that, we give you another book details activity. And now we've got 2 book details activity. The same type of activity, but 2 different instances of it get built onto the task stack. And obviously, this can extend from there. So the question becomes, back will do one thing. back will unwind you through that browsing history. I was looking at this book. I went and looked at a related book. Now I'd like to come back to that first book. Up is structural navigation. Up gives you the ability to bypass that intermediate state and return up to that original list. Now, that may not seem like that big a deal for this kind of short example, but imagine browser sessions that could get quite lengthy. I might go from book to book to book to book to book to book, and then in the old school, I could go back to back to back to back to back to back to back. Up lets you skip all that and just kind of jump right up to the list. The second instance where back and up differ critically is when you have a task that's being built up from multiple applications. So I'll go through one here. I'll start at home. I'll go into YouTube. I'm browsing a list of YouTube videos. I'll pick one out, and I'll watch it. And then I'll elect to share it over Gmail. So the Gmail compose activity comes to the front of the task stack. So from here, back is going to do the natural thing. If I decide, I don't really want to share that cat video with my friend, back gets me out of that context, takes me back to the lovely cat video. But if instead I wanted to remain within Gmail, maybe the fact of firing up that compose reminded me of something else I needed to do, the up lets me stay inside. And in fact, it'll take me to a higher level activity that wasn't in the task stack at any point. This is going to graduate me up to the conversation list, the inbox that's associated with it. And a couple of critical things happen here. We add that activity. We finish the compose activity. That one's gone. And we split the task. So we have one task, our old YouTube task, now sans that useless Gmail compose activity. And we have a new task, the Gmail task, focused on the conversation list. And we've also carried along Home's launcher activity for the ride, so that if I'm at the conversation list and now I hit back, I'll actually wind up back at home. Recents is actually pretty straightforward. It behaves the same as it did for that hidden function way back in Android.1. But what we significantly changed in Honeycomb was to kind of just give the user a much cleaner interaction with it. We introduced a dedicated button in the system or in the navigation area. It brings the entire task stack forward, and we just added a lot of detail that helps the user make that decision. Instead of just getting the name and the app icon, we're now giving the user those plus a screenshot of the topmost activity in that task stack, which is helpful for both identifying, where's that task I'm trying to get back to? Oh, it's this map. Yeah, it's that map. As well as kind of orienting the user for the switch. The user's already kind of remembering the context that they're going to be going into even before that animation completes. So it's a much less jarring transition for the user, which made it much better. Finally, we're delivering on that great multitasking story that we always knew Android was capable of supporting.
So coming back to our diagram from before, when I choose task B from recents here, what actually happens? So when you bring task B to the top using the recents UI, recents is starting the root activity of task B with these flags. Remember, when we start the root activity of a task, it brings it forward. So we've already covered what new task does, but what about this task on home thing? So this was a new flag that we added in Honeycomb. And this is the flag that allows us to bring launcher along for the ride, like Rich mentioned, to sort of keep this more consistent state that is more predictable for users when they switch around. So after that switch, task B is now on top with home immediately beneath it. And if I back through Gmail, I'll end up on home no matter how I got into Gmail, just as I expect.
So one last visit to the timeline. So we talked about Honeycomb, we talked about ICS, and today we're proud to announce nothing else new. We haven't changed it. You're welcome.
So now you know a little bit more of the history of how we got where we are here. And it's important to remember that it's really easy to find these local maxima for your app's experiences and sort of implement special functionality to make that happen. But following system conventions makes your app more intuitive to people that already know how other apps behave in the system, and when those apps follow those conventions too. But as you've already seen, the Android framework has a lot of intricate options and opportunities to do things differently. So how do we actually implement all these guidelines that we're talking about here? Well, back is really easy. We just leave it alone. Let it go ahead and unwind fragment transactions or finish activities just as it does by default, and let it move to the previous activity in the task, so on and so forth. But what about this up thing? So we talked before about how up can switch tasks. When you deliberately task switch, here's how you bring Launcher along for the ride the way that Recents does. And we talked about this a little bit, but this really helps reinforce this hub and spoke model of tasks for the users, with Launcher as this hub. Each one of the tasks kind of splits out, forming the spokes. When a task is fully replaced, then traversing back through a synthetic stack and returning to the previous task instead feels really, really weird. So landing at home reinforces structure. So when we implement up, we need to fully replace the task that's there, again, because of this new tabs problem that we talked about before. By replacing the task, we're effectively sort of faking history, though, and some of you may be wondering, why would you really want to do that? Why not just have back be back? Why are you lying to the users?
Yeah, there are actually a few different cases where the activity that's a logical parent may or may not be something that's already on that task stack. So we'll see this in more detail when we talk about widgets and notifications in just a little bit, and actually behave very similarly to up in that regard.
So that means that another ability that we'll need is being able to replace an existing task. So for example, imagine that the user is at home with task state already built up for Gmail, Talk, and YouTube. That's A, B, and C is listed on the slide here. So from home, the user navigates into Gmail from its widget. So this needs to be sort of a deep link in there. And it's the same story for up when you're composing from a different task, like in our previous example. So using that widget will make the old task state of Gmail invalid. So we use this clear task flag, since we don't want leftover state or duplicate Gmail tasks anywhere in the global activity stack. So as much as systems programmers really enjoy packing arrays full of values and getting exact flag combinations right through all of that, we really wanted to provide a little bit of a nicer interface on top of that to help get the details right. So in both the Jelly Bean framework and in the support library, Task Stack Builder is that nicer interface. So it can determine the full synthetic task stack that you'll need based on the structural hierarchy from the declared parent activities in your manifest, as well as generate some pending intents for notifications and launcher widgets when you need those. We've got some code examples in the SDK that you can take a look at for more details. So how do we pull all these little pieces together to implement up? Well, the good news is that in Jelly Bean, you don't have to. It's all completely done for you. Just give us the metadata in your manifest about the parent activities, and we'll take care of everything else. So sometimes you need to specify some other intent extras to those activities along the way. For example, if one of your parent activities is a category view, and you need to know what category you're viewing, you may express that as some sort of an intent extra. So in that case, you can override an activity method and edit the intent in the task stack builder that's being used under the hood whenever it's needed. So we'll also be bringing this to the app-compat library component of the support library that we talked about yesterday in the multi-versioning Android UIs session, if any of you were there.
Okay, so the last major topic we need to cover as far as navigation goes is widgets and notifications. And these are both examples of a pattern we kind of internally call deep links. These are things that let you bypass certain kind of intro screens in an app and target an activity that's deeper within its hierarchy. Widgets are pretty straightforward in the sense that we know that those are always going to be new tasks. You're always firing them from home. They're effectively acting as a launcher activity. They can apply task affinity, as Adam talked about before. But they're not that complex. Notifications are a little trickier, so we'll cover those last. So here's just a quick example showing widgets. So back to the old format. We got the task stack and the screens building up. So from home, I have a Gmail widget on my home screen, and I see a message, conversation within my inbox, and I touch on that. That lets you bypass the conversation list screen, and you navigate directly to the conversation view. But actually representing that screen in the task stack is valuable. Keeping that conversation list around matters a lot. It doesn't matter so much right now, like right at this instant, but where it matters a lot to the user is when they've been inside Gmail for a while. They come in, they read that message, they read several other conversations past that, and they've been in the app for a little while, and they hit back. They're not aware at that instant that, oh, the doorway I used to enter was the widget, so of course it's going to kick me out to home. It's a surprising change if we were to just do that. So we don't. When the widget calls into the conversation view, it can add the conversation list activity to the task stack. That way, when the user hits up or back, they're being kept within the application. If they really wanted to go home, well, they could have hit home to begin with, or they could just hit back again. Notifications. So a common flow for notifications is, I'm in one app. So I start home, I launch again into Gmail, I'm reading a conversation, and in comes a notification. I pull down the shade, no activity, no task stack change there. That's just purely local. And I've got a new notification from Talk. A new message has come in, and I want to read that. So I tap that notification, and now we have the Talk activity to deal with. We're going to go straight to the chat view. Again, we're bypassing that friends chat, or the friends list that we'd seen in the earlier examples. The question here is, what should the relationship between that new activity and the prior task be? Is this going to be a new task? Is this just something that we put on top of the previous task?
So knowing what you now know about how all of this sort of fits together and what we found our user expectations were not just right immediately, but several hours later, this really doesn't work. We can't just hop back to the previous task. I mean, this is something that became muscle memory for a lot of users over time in previous versions of Android. You answer a notification, you do whatever you need to do there, and then you hit back, and then you continue doing what you're doing. So this actually caused us a lot of problems. It was trivially easy to create this super confusing state that users wouldn't discover until much, much later. So something really needed to change. So the problem that it created was that the task stack was no longer predictable. If you last opened Gmail through a notification, hours or days later, your Gmail task state would be very different than if you had opened it through the front door. So as you go switching back and forth between tasks, just as you use your device, then this gets really massively confusing, and users just started attributing this to Android being dumb or confusing, one thing or another. So the idea of back staying within the current task is something that we weren't willing to give up. There's a ton of psychology behind maintaining that expectation in each task. Context switches are very, very powerful. People remember a lot about an old context when they switch back, and then they forget about the context that they switched from. So have you ever walked through a doorway into another room and suddenly forgotten what you were doing? I mean, you're not alone in this.
Yeah, there was actually kind of a pretty well-known psych study that covered this exact topic that got some play in the popular press, so you may have heard about it. And it looked at what happens when participants were asked to engage in memory tests while they were walking through doorways. And they did it in both physical and in virtual environments. Spoiler alert, people forgot stuff when they walked through the doorway. So we didn't want our users to kind of suffer the same fate when they did a task switch. I have to just kind of call out in this quote, I love this little bit that talks about episodes of activity. I read this quote, I swear I didn't doctor it, and that just screams task stack to me when I look at it.
Okay, so we have all of these crazy flags available. Can we cheat a little bit? Like, can we really keep that flow of just hitting back and going right back to where we wanted to be? So here's one possible trick. We could start a new task, but don't set the task on home flag. Well, this trick will make the back button work for this use case, but the rest of the existing task still ends up being there to mash back through, and that's really not very great. And if we add the clear task flag, then it really leaves us with a bogus state. Back becomes unpredictable either way. If you clear the task, then returning to that task later from recents means you back right back into home again. If you don't, then you have to back through the rest of the task before you get back to the previous task, and you still lost the quick back. So that's not going to work. So, okay, what if we really, really cheat? You can try a really dirty trick here, but this will leave this orphaned activity hanging around that you won't actually be able to get back to in any sort of a discoverable way. If you answered a notification and then wrote half of a message in talk, then you're basically hosed if you leave and want to come back. And then you get into this matter of like, okay, well, we could go ahead and make everyone try and save drafts for everything that you're doing, one thing or another. But we really didn't think it was a good idea to expect developers or even want them to take on this much duplication and special casing. So notifications are supposed to be this first-class thing in Android. But just as a note, this trick actually is useful in some other cases. So if you have like a deliberately orphaned summary dialog or a screen that shows more than a notification can on its own, but it's really just an extension of that notification before you jump into the content, then this can be really useful. Calendar reminders are one place where we do this in the base Android system, when you get sort of a pop-up that shows multiple reminders that have been collapsed. So the solution that we finally settled on was that we treat notifications just like we treat widgets in up. So that means that navigating into an app from a notification replaces the target task entirely with that same sort of deep link synthetic task stack that we use for up and for widgets. So conceptually, that means notifications have become a shortcut for going home, clearing out the current task state by swiping away in recents, opening the app, and then just following the shortest path down the UI to get to the content that you actually cared about. But you're doing it all in one step. So Task Stack Builder gives you an easy way to accomplish this. So the implications of this are that, yeah, we really did just lose that case of you can't just use back from answering a notification to switch to the previous task anymore. And it is kind of unfortunate. But the good news is that since we've elevated recents to this first-class element that's right there on the navigation bar all the time, then getting back to the last thing that you were doing is very simple. So the most recent task is always sorted closest to the button, so it's a very quick 2 taps to get back to the previous thing that you were doing. But more importantly, we realized from all the user testing that it was less important to keep this quick back than it was not to surprise people with a bogus task state much, much later down the road. And to sort of reinforce this idea of the task switch as we go back and forth, we really try and tell the story with animation in Jelly Bean.
OK, so wrapping up, 3 things that I'd love you to take away from this session. The first is think about the structure of your app early on in your planning process. You know, the first talk this morning did a really good job of kind of illustrating how you think about what you want your app to achieve, kind of what is the app in and of itself. You know, don't be the bag of activities. You don't have to be like this exact hierarchy. There are a lot of different hierarchies that are out there, and there are a lot of just apps that you can look at as exemplars of that. I mean, you could be broad or narrow. You could be shallow or deep. You could be balanced or imbalanced in your hierarchy. Let the activities and the relationships drive the structure that you try to implement.
So another thing that we'd like you to do is don't just test your app navigation in isolation. It's very, very easy when you're in an intense debugging session to just make some quick changes, push the new APK to your device, test it out really quick just within your app that just launched from your debugger, and say, OK, great, it works, we're done. The thing is that as soon as you have any sort of sophisticated navigation in your application, this doesn't actually exercise all of the different cases that users are going to run into. Make sure that you test all of the navigation in and out of your app. That's the notifications, widgets, and any sort of intent fulfillment that happens from other applications. If your application can act as a viewer for certain types of content, if other applications can share to your app, make sure that you test all of those things too. And most importantly, go ahead and dog food your own application too. Test it over a number of days. See how it interacts with other applications on the system, and make sure that it's behaving consistently with the other applications that people are going to be using day to day.
And then finally, why are we doing this? Why do I care about this so much? Users always win. Your users always win when apps behave consistently. You've kind of heard the consistency point a number of times today, but it's important. There's no need for a user to learn how to navigate your application if you're doing the standard, doing the consistent thing. They can take the knowledge they've learned in one app and apply it to yours directly. You also don't have to spend time introducing a tutorial, teaching the users how to use your navigation. It gives the users a sense of mastery. That ability to take the knowledge learned in one place and apply it into a different context is what contributes to that. And your app is the beneficiary of that. You kind of the user gets all these positive associations with it. Adam often talks about this being, and one way that users express this is they say, oh, that app's intuitive. It's just doing the things they would expect to do without having had to learn what the app is asking them to do. And it lets the users concentrate on the kind of key things your app is trying to deliver. And then finally, it makes the whole experience feel better to the users. Your app, all the apps, all the devices. We're working really hard to try to bring consistency to all of the Google applications. And hopefully you'll notice in Jelly Bean, we've made a tremendous number of improvements when it comes to kind of using navigation consistently. I'm sure there's a couple that we've missed. We're working on it.
But we couldn't have missed any, Rich. I don't think that's possible.
Yeah. That's why they pay us the medium bucks. We've covered a lot today. If you want to go back and review any of this material, I've tried to concentrate on the whys. Why did we come to these decisions that we've made? But if you just need the guidelines, they're in the design guide. If you go to the navigation pattern there, you can review it. It's got a lot of this content or other related examples that you can go through again. And with that, thank you very much, and thank you. And we have time for questions.
Hi, do you have some advice for tools to draw the diagrams or some tools like UML to create the navigation diagrams?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we use a lot of different tools within the team. I happen to use Illustrator just because I do navigation and wireframing at the same time. We have a number of designers who use like OmniGraffle to kind of do quick connections. I've worked at places where we've used PowerPoint or Visio. I'm dating myself. Pen and paper is usually good enough too. Oftentimes, if the app just isn't that large. I don't know if you have anything to add. No. Okay.
No, I think that that pretty well covers.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi. Hi. I have a question related to how the back navigation is supposed to be working when you're having a list view on a tablet. So on a tablet, for example, you have a list view, and then you're showing beside it in a separate fragment the icon, like the item of the list view. And then on the list, you select the next one, and then the next one, and it displays shows.
Yes.
What's the expected behavior? Is the expected behavior of the back button to go back and show me those other list items they showed before?
No, that's not the expectation is more that back will operate at the level of the entire screen. So kind of any internal.
Then basically behaves the same as the app button.
Again, but it depends on how you entered it. Yes.
Yeah, but if I entered into the list view and then go through the list, the back button doesn't actually do the expected back operation in terms of I went back to that list item I saw before, and that's expected?
That's expected. Another example of this would be tabs. Back doesn't operate across tab views. So if I kind of come in and I'm kind of browsing, even on the IO app, I'm browsing kind of through the top level. Back isn't going to take me to the prior tab. It's just going to kind of treat that all as state.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, that's right. There's a few of these constructs that we have, and just like you mentioned, tabs are one of them, where we really distinguish between what types of actions do or don't create navigation history. And tabs are definitely one that we decided do not create navigation history. And choosing different list items to focus on in a two-pane UI is another one of those very analogous sort of actions that doesn't itself create navigation history.
Can you update that in the design guide? Because it is not explicit from there, and I was kind of thinking that it actually should be doing the actual back thing, and therefore implemented that in my app, and that's how it works. But I find that, for example, the Gmail app and all these apps, they don't do that, so I'm kind of contemplating to ripping it out again. So is that since you're saying that that is the expected behavior,
Yes.
and maybe update the design guide, that would be great.
Yep, I think we can add that. We're actually trying to add more and more depth to our tablet support in the design guide, so that's a good call out. Thank
Cool,
you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, so I guess we should add that same note that we have about tabs to the left pane lists.
So with the move from Gingerbread to Honeycomb and ICS, you guys did away with the option menu, which had a visual interface and a nice grid layout, to the overflow menu, which is a big giant list of text.
That's right.
Now, some of us prefer to have a visual interface for people rather than just a bunch of text to read. And so before I and others start getting into coming up with our own ideas of how that menu should work, I'm curious if you guys have had any discussion and ideas on how to integrate visual pieces into the overflow menu.
Yeah, I guess my kind of
Yeah,
initial response to that would be that, I mean, the old menu would give you, visibility for 5 options and then like a more button, which would then fall through to a text-only display at that point. So when we designed the action bar, and particularly in ICS when we brought it to phone, we gave you the split action bar, so you could still have 5 visible targets within your application if you wanted to, and then kind of kick over to the text overflow. So we tried to, in the action bar, kind of give you a similar amount of graphical targets that you can give it. We don't have any plans right now to kind of introduce graphics into the action overflow itself, though.
Yeah, the idea was really to reduce the navigation depth that the user had to traverse by one. So everything that would have appeared in that menu panel, we're now trying to bring on screen just by default, so that anything that really needs visual navigation should be there present that is a little bit more discoverable than something that's hidden behind the menu button. Yep. So in that case, we're positioning the overflow menu as something that really is for some of those hidden options that are not frequent, important, or typical.
Yep. Thank you.
Hi, so this is regarding the back button. If I had to navigate to a page, to an activity from a dialog, and I hit the back button, I go through the stack of dialogues that I didn't want to. I mean, and as a user, I would expect back to go to the previous activity without hitting all the dialogues that I had to go to the next activity. So is this behavior remaining, or?
So I'm sorry, I guess I don't quite understand. So you had a case where you had multiple nested dialogues that were created?
Yeah, I had 2 dialogues, which was important to go to make some decisions before we go to the next activity. But when
I see.
When I hit the back button, I would actually expect to go to the previous activity rather than fall on all the dialogues again.
Right. So what the system alert dialogues do by default is whenever you choose one of those options in the bottom bar from the dialog, we actually dismiss the dialog as part of navigating to the next thing. So that way there's no extra state still left over. If you're ending up with a lot of stacked dialogues one on top of another, then that's probably a situation that you want to avoid getting into up front rather than worrying about how to clean it up after the fact. So when you've already made a decision from a dialogue, that should be about it for the dialogue. So go ahead and dismiss it and let the next thing take over.
Yeah, and the behavior you're describing would be kind of strange and jarring. I agree. We would want to not take you back to the dialogue and take you back to the kind of the root activity underneath it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
Thanks.
Sure.
Hi, I'm constantly having to explain to my parents that there aren't actually 2 back buttons on the screen.
That's not true. There's 2. There's a back and an up.
Are there any plans to make the up button face up?
So that's kind of interesting. We actually started, lots of people who think this. So believe it or not, this is actually what it looked like in the first release of Honeycomb. We actually had a little glyph that pointed up and to the left. And as it turned out, because of just the way that the spacing all works out, nobody saw it. It was effectively invisible. Like it almost looked like a little shaded corner. We played around with a lot of different glyphs to try it out. And in our user testing, we just found that something a lot more in your face that we ended up using as that sort of left-facing chevron was way more effective in terms of just how it read to the majority of the people that we user tested with.
Yeah, the other thing I'll add is like up. We think about up all the time. Hierarchy isn't kind of an odd concept. For most of our consumers, they don't view apps that way. And even though we're kind of expressing it as the up button, and that's what we call it, they think of it as back in some sense, back in the app versus this other back.
Yeah, right. Yeah. All right, thanks, guys.
Sure, thank you.
So the up button in the new Google Plus app, opens up that little slide out menu on the side.
We knew this was coming.
Yeah. Have you used YouTube?
I haven't checked it on YouTube.
Same thing.
All right. So is that going to be a standard or?
Yeah, I mean,
So this is basically the next problem that Rich and I are going to tackle after everything from I/O settles down here. This idea of the nav drawer is something that has become really popular in the community, and we want to make sure that we have some really strong guidelines and support around it. And I think that out of some of the different ones that are around, I think that YouTube probably meets most of the direction that we're moving toward for that. And part of that is just because of the way that it implements the direct manipulation, as you can like actually grab hold of the content and slide it over, rather than only relying on the up button. But in the case of something like Google+, the up button actually is semantically correct as well, because it's something where you're saying, I want to perform some navigation one level up in the hierarchy from where I currently am.
yeah, I mean, as far as just kind of, if you're thinking about doing it for your apps, the things I would keep in mind, because I think this will track the guidance we'll give most closely. Think of it as almost an alternate visualization of the drop-down that you can get as a view changer as well. It's part of the local state of that topmost activity. It means that kind of where we would never have an up button before on that topmost screen, we give you an affordance that still looks like up that pulls this drawer out. And that's in addition to any kind of gestural affordance, an edge swipe that you'd like to introduce that panel with.
So, are there plans to make this native?
I think that we've talked about doing something in the support library for it,
Yeah.
because I mean, of course, the problem with adding some like core navigation pattern like this natively is that how many people are going to use it for the next 6 to 18 months.
Yes.
So I think that we're probably targeting something closer to the support library for it.
So we don't have anything to announce today, but it's definitely something we're looking at. And just kind of one last point I'll throw in on that. If that drawer is open, then the behavior of back should just kind of clearly be to just kind of cancel that drawer and not take the navigation. So it's a state within that activity. And it could be decorated differently at some point, but for now, the affordance we have available is up, so that's what we're using. Yeah. I mean, I think you don't physically move up. You're kind of, in terms of the options you're presenting to the user, kind of they are upward.
Yeah,
This is a magic hierarchy.
Right. And in terms of the idea of back closing the drawer, I would think of that as any of the other sort of modal states that you can get into. It's the same as the IME. It's the same as any of the action modes that you can pull down for editing, so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, a couple times in your presentation you talked about tasks being in a bogus state. One being you're in Gmail, you get a notification for a text message. The text message shows up, and apparently a text message without a corresponding conversation view underneath it is somehow a bogus state. Could you elaborate what's bogus about that?
Yeah, so the idea there is that if you have the detail view of a particular text message, then if you don't have the conversation list above it, then the problem isn't right there when you're working with it. The problem is, okay, you get another notification, you answer it, you press home, you leave one thing or another, and then you actually come back into the SMS app or the Talk app sometime later through recents. And at that point, you've kind of crossed through the doorway. And that's where you want the back button's behavior to be somewhat consistent with your expectations. And if you start that activity without having the conversation list below it, then what that means is that the back button is going to finish that activity, and then you're going to land back at home. And then that ends up being inconsistent with expectations that the user would have, depending on if they got into it from a different way, again, hours or even days earlier.
So switching back to it from recents after you've left it.
Yeah.
Yep. Or from another notification, like any mechanism at that point, it's going to have, I guess what I describe as an incomplete state above it.
Right.
So
and
it's not invalid. It just means that once I try to exit it, I'm going to wind up somewhere unexpected.
Right. This is one of the things that we found really contributed to a lot of users feeling like back was unpredictable in Android as a whole. It wasn't a matter of what it did right away. It was a matter of like state that got created a really long time ago that wasn't really intentional, but as soon as you come back to it, then suddenly everything's kind of goofed up, and it's right after you did another task switch, you're trying to do something where your expectations were one way, suddenly you get flustered, and it's like, oh, this stupid phone, I hate it. So.
Don't they feel frustrated after responding to a notification, hitting back, and it doesn't go back to where they were?
If they're really familiar with that old behavior, yes, there's some kind of muscle learning they have to do to shift that behavior recents, but we still think we're supporting it.
Yeah, we found that in practice in our own dog fooding with Googlers, who, by the way, are probably the most critical audience for issues like this, we had a lot of initial frustration in the first few days, and then it really kind of trailed off after that once you started training yourself. I know that I was the same way. I mean, Matthias isn't around here, but I actually locked him in a conference room for the better part of an afternoon trying to convince him that no, we had to find some way to keep this behavior. And in the end, I was not only convinced that this was the right way to go, but that once I actually started using it this way, once it's in action, you start switching over to recents and it becomes extremely natural to the point where you pick up an older device and you're like, this is entirely wrong. So a lot of it really is just sort of a matter of habituation.
Yep, thanks.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. You mentioned going up through the stack and then basically hitting the up and going all the way, bypassing the middle ones.
Mm-hmm.
And you were showing the task stack as basically having those vanish.
Mm-hmm.
But how do you make that happen since, conceptually you could also be getting back to that home screen just by following other navigation, which would put it on the top.
Yes.
With all those back in there.
Yes, there's a few ways to do this. The first is that, in Jelly Bean and Forward, there's actually a specific method that does this. Or wait, no, never mind, that's a different case. So as you're jumping up for that type of navigation, essentially you have this other flag that's called the flag activity clear top. And it means that I'm launching into this task, but clear everything else off the top if this same target activity already exists in my task stack. So we've used this in the past to really try and prevent cycles in navigation, and that's exactly what it does in this case as well.
Okay, and somewhat similar, we respond to a number of deep links. We capture, you've probably formatted URLs, et cetera. And so if we come in for item A, and then we may stay in the app for a little bit, and then we go back out, and we come in again following another link for item B, and we go off in ways. We've currently, so our stack for our task currently has items A and B on it.
Mm-hmm.
And
So-
those are handled by the same activity, just
Right.
different data. Now we get a deep link again for item A, but it just brings our activity to the front, showing item B.
Yes, that's that task switching behavior that we described when it matches the root intent.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm guessing that your data URI is an exact match for what A was in that particular case. So that's definitely why you're seeing that behavior.
Actually, it's not. Our data
It's not?
it's an exact match for item A, yes.
Yeah. So if it's an exact match for item A, that's why it's bringing that task forward, even though you've got other tasks still on top of it. And so generally, it sounds like this means that your activity is acting as a viewer, sort of as a helper for another app. Is that correct?
Actually, I'm with IMDb. And
Okay.
So basically, if somebody follows a link that has been shared to them or whatever for
Right.
a title or a celebrity or whatever.
Mm-hmm. So it's basically a web link that you've registered an HTTP URI intent filter for?
Right.
Excellent. So generally the way that we do this is that doesn't actually launch a new task. So that shouldn't be launching into the new task to begin with, because it's conceptually part of exactly what the user was doing in whatever task linked them to it. So that's our case before where we were doing the share YouTube video off to Gmail, where in that case, the detail view from the IMDb app would be launching as as an activity on the current task already. So in that case, you wouldn't be creating this other state that you've still got left here. Now, there's another flag that is kind of important to be aware of for this that is useful when linking out to this, but sometimes when you're just handling an HTTP URI, it's not really feasible to be able to set it. but that's flag activity clear when task reset. So it's kind of a mouthful, but what that does is that makes a distinction on whether or not the user comes back to that. So say they were in the browser. So they're in the browser, they hit a link to an IMDb page, and it brings up the app instead. So it's launched that on the browser's activity stack. Now, ideally, if you're linking in from something else and using this as sort of a viewer, you could also set this flag, and then that means that if the user later comes in through recents, then okay, it's exactly the same as it was. The IMDb activity is still on top. But in the case where the user relaunches from the launcher itself, they press browser, they want to get browser, they don't want to get the IMDb app. So that actually acts as that task reset at that point. And any cut points where that flag was specified, all those tasks get finished and are cleared off. But that aside, the general idea is that you really want to be trying to launch within the current task of whatever is linking into your activity, so that way you don't end up creating your own task stack of a whole ton of extra history there.
Okay. We did use the, on certain links, and we used the clear top, but you know, I'm not sure that the intent that the activity that actually responds to that intent actually gets dismissed, and this other fragment activity gets loaded on top.
Oh, I see. So this is when you're navigating up from that other detail view from before? Or?
No, it's actually, in order to cover some of the other cases, we had to have basically an activity chooser activity that handles the intent coming in, and then goes off to fragment activities that actually load everything else. So it's a little complicated.
I see. So you've essentially got a
actually,
detail activity that holds a bunch of other pieces
Yeah,
there?
we're over our time, so
Okay,
let's just cut the questions on the mic off. Please feel free to come up, and then everybody else.
Yeah,
we
definitely.
can just do it
If
up
we
on
get
the
kicked
stage.
out of this room, then let's talk more outside too.
Thanks.